work that is conducted in order to answer a research question. We are always conscious of what factors or what entities can affect the results in such a way that it confounds that result or lowers the integrity of that result. One possible candidate that can lower the integrity of the results to a research question is bias. It is an effect that alters a statistical result by systematically distorting it. Where can bias come from? Or how can bias be introduced into the results of a statistical finding? One way could be during the data collection, which is classified as interviewer or response bias. So you see, this is bias introduced by the way the questions are asked. That could be by the tone of voice of the interviewer. It could be the way the interviewer looks at the respondent or any other data provider. On the other hand, bias can also be classified as non-response bias. And that would be bias introduced into the statistical results by unanswered emails or surveys, and or even phone calls. If the goal is to study a particular population of interest and you have called that population, as in members of that population, and calls are made at a time when most of them are not on hand to pick up that call, and you're only able to go by the data values you got from those who answered the call. What if those who answered that call were people, who don't really represent exactly the general population characteristics? Then the final results that you derive from analyzing the data set there might be plagued by non-response bias. Next in line would be observer bias, and that is bias introduced by different data values that are collected on the same experimental unit or the same entity. In other words, if two individuals are safety protocol officials working for some county and they've gone to inspect a contractor somewhere, if they return back with different assessment values, that can introduce observer bias into the final report that is put in place for or reported for that particular contractor. That brings a level of distrust into the process, and this comes from observer bias. Then finally, we have selection bias, which is bias caused by a poor selection, by a poor selection of sample units in such a way that the data values or responses are become predictable. We saw an example of this when we considered convenient sampling. If we select sample units in such a way that they are predictable, for instance, if a politician asks his neighbors about a controversial issue, the response or the data values that he will get are almost predictable. More likely than not, the neighbors are likely to say things that align with his interest. And that might not be truly reflective of the general population characteristic. It means that at the end of the day, the results that will be obtained from analyzing the responses from the neighbors would be plagued or affected by selection bias. So, with that said, let's take a couple of examples on recognizing the different types of bias. Question one: when people fail to respond to a survey, the data collection process may suffer from non-response bias. What do you think? I would say that is true because we are writing true, T if the statement is true, and F if the statement is false. Secondly, data collected on the internet can generally be considered accurate since the data must go through a screening process before they are placed on the internet. Well, We definitely know that this is false. Not everything on the internet is necessarily true. Next, recently, an analyst in a company's marketing department surveyed customers regarding how often they buy a particular product. One customer indicated that she purchased the product 17 times in the last 6 months, but the analyst recorded the response as 71 times. This is an example of observer bias. That would be false because with observer bias, we must have at least two observers who have observed two different things. And that is what we define as observer bias. In this case, recording 71 instead of 17, this will be called in statistics a measurement error, not observer bias. Lastly, selection bias occurs when the respondent decides which of the questions on the survey to answer. That would be true or false. That would definitely be false because with selection bias, it is the selection of sample units in such a way that they are predictable and so they offer predictable what data values which may not necessarily convey reality about the population of interest. So, in this case, if respondents choose what questions to answer, that might lead to non response bias rather than selection bias.